In the 18th century, the mentally retarded were often ignored, punished, and exploited. Today, things are supposed to be different. Modern 20th century man is much more scientific and civilized. Today, we no longer punish the mentally retarded. We don't exploit them either. We have come a long, long way. Now we ship them 25 miles out of town to a state-operated institution and forget them while they decay from neglect.
Pennhurst, a state school and hospital, was designed to house the mentally and physically disabled. But did it succeed in doing that? Did it ever attempt to move beyond just storing the disabled and try to rehabilitate them into society? To understand these questions, we must delve deeper into the history of Pennhurst. Pennhurst opened in November 1908, and in just 4 years, it began to suffer from an issue that would plague it for its entire existence: overcrowding. The institution originally supported its running costs through making residents work without pay. The largest and most profitable of Pennhurst ventures was its farming program. The institution could pay for all running costs and even turn a profit, since they did not have to pay the working patients through this farming program. The total campus was 1,400 acres in area, located in Spring City, Pennsylvania, with 710 of that being used for farming. The remaining 690 acres were used for other activities. In 1913, the state legislature of Pennsylvania appointed a commission for the care of the mentally disabled. The commission decided that mentally challenged people were unfit to function alone in society and recommended all mentally challenged individuals be placed in custodial care. At the same time, they did not build any new facilities, so disabled people were placed into already crowded systems. This is what started Pennhurst's overcrowding issues, and they would not be alleviated until the final closing of the institution. On top of this, the state did not provide additional funding to account for this sudden influx of new residents. In 1916, the Board of Trustees approved a new plan to construct all-female cottages for patients who could live on their own without direct assistance. The females were removed from the main campus to reduce the amount of unexpected pregnancies within the institute. The original campus plans had not even accounted for female residents, let alone 700 of them. Pennhurst experienced a massive increase in new commitments in 1918. This came from the idea of eugenics, which was a social movement claiming to improve the genetic features of human population by selective breeding and sterilization. Eugenicists believed that with the removal of mentally disabled people from the population, they would slowly wipe out the genetic defects which cause mental disabilities. Society grasped hold of this new idea and started to commit more and more people with minor disabilities to state institutions. Pennhurst was one of such institutes affected with this sudden population growth. Pennhurst continued its operations normally for the next 30 years, with a progressive increase in residents. The original campus finally finished construction in 1921 with the opening of the Pennhurst Hospital. More and more residents were committed, but the institute could not afford to construct new dormitories. For 9 years, no new buildings were added to the campus, even though Pennhurst already had a population of 2,100 residents. This was almost twice the amount that the campus was originally intended to house. In 1955, Pennhurst's overcrowding issue was at its peak. The population was at an all-time high of 3,500 individuals, but no new buildings were added to the campus. In order to accommodate a population that was almost triple what the campus had originally been designed to hold, the state legislature approved the construction of 2 new campuses for the institute. One campus was located west of Gettysburg, and the other was in Whitehaven, near Scranton. These non-main campus locations would eventually become the Hamburg and Whitehaven state institutions. In 1967, Pennhurst had managed to reduce its population by 636 residents due to the creation of these off-site campuses. Pennhurst was now at 2,864 residents. Conditions did not get any better. However, as the institute was severely overcrowded. In 1967, the United States of America had 193,188 mentally challenged individuals institutionalized. There were 6,139 disabled in Pennsylvania, meaning Pennhurst accounted for the 47% of all institutionalized individuals within the state. That number really shows how overcrowded Pennhurst actually was. There were institutes in America that had more residents, but all those asylums had specifically designed campuses to accommodate the large amount of residents. Pennhurst was unique in the fact that it had not been designed to hold anywhere near the amount of people it did. Pennhurst was not like these larger institutes. It received funding for the original amount of residents it was intended for, even though it now held 2.5 times that amount. Most of the institutes larger than Pennhurst, such as the infamous New York City Lunatic Asylum, better known as the Octagon, received funding based on the amount of residents living on campus. This facility served as the primary institute for the care and rehabilitation of mentally disabled in New York City. It also happened to be one of the largest in the United States. The New York City Lunatic Asylum received almost quadruple the funding that Pennhurst did, even though it only had a few hundred more residents. The lack of funding meant that the campus of Pennhurst slipped further into a state of neglect. The administration couldn't spare the money to add more buildings to the campus, or even renovate the old ones. They spent all their available budget on medical supplies and healthcare items for the residents. This serious lack of funds made conditions miserable within Pennhurst. Many residents only received one meal a day, and minimal amounts of healthcare. The tiny budget meant that Pennhurst could only afford a small amount of staff. Some wards only have one nurse on the clock at a time, and there was only one doctor present on campus 24 hours a day. Some residents only received 10 minutes of psychiatric care per year. There simply were not enough staff to go around, and Pennhurst couldn't afford to hire more unless they received additional funding.
These are some of the sights and sounds of Pennhurst, the state institution for the mentally retarded. It's located in Spring City, Chester County. In 1908, when the institution first opened, the man in charge bitterly complained to the state that the conditions were already overcrowded. He transferred many of the patients to Q1, a classroom building.
The first glimpse the public got of the inside of Pennhurst was in 1968. An NBC reporter, Bill Baldini, created a series of 5-minute-long exposés. These aired weekly on NBC and brought public attention to the horrific overcrowding occurring at Pennhurst. Prior to these segments, all the general public knew about Pennhurst was that it was just another nut house. No one had ever recorded footage of the inside of Pennhurst while it was operating before Baldini filmed his exposé for NBC. Baldini found that it was not the employees' direct fault, it was the fact that Pennhurst campus was not fitted to hold that many residents at one time, and it was drastically understaffed. Baldini brought these concerns up to the superintendent of Pennhurst, who told Baldini that they were doing everything they could, they just did not have the funds to provide sufficient care for their residents.
Yes, our rated capacity is 1,984. And
how many people do you have?
We currently have 2,791.
How many people do you need here at Pennhurst?
I'd like to see our 1,500 people on in our personnel complement. And in order to pay these extra 700 people, we'd probably need about $4 million.
Doctor, when was the last time the Secretary of Health and Welfare or the Governor visited here at Pennhurst?
Secretary of Welfare was here approximately 6 weeks ago.
What were his comments after he saw the deplorable conditions, the rundown facilities, the overcrowding, the lack of help? What was his feeling? What did he tell you?
Secretary Georges said that let's do everything we can to alleviate conditions at Pennhurst and place Pennhurst in top priority for clearing up things.
In other words, he put Pennhurst ahead of the other state institutions?
He made this statement, yes, sir.
Baldini found the lack of funds absolutely sickening. He did some digging into the actual amount of money Pennhurst received. He uncovered that Pennhurst received enough money to spend about $5.90 on each ward every day. 80% of this money paid the administrative costs of the institute, leaving only 75 cents for the entire ward. A ward could hold up to 80 people, and that 75 cents had to pay for food and care of the mentally challenged. Accounting for inflation, that is $5.06 in today's dollar for 80 people's care and food. In comparison, 5 of the largest zoos in the area received $7.15 a day per ward. Adjusted for inflation, that is $48.23. The zoos received $48, while Pennhurst received $7. Baldini was shocked at these numbers. This was one of the major points he made in his expose, that society cared more for animals than the mentally disabled. Baldini called for the institute to be given more money and more state-paid workers be sent to boost Pennhurst's small workforce. Baldini's reaction to the whole situation was shock. It opened his eyes to the sheer number of mentally challenged present in Pennhurst and how few people actually worked there.
Can you describe the first day you actually visited Pennhurst even without your camera?
Yes, I was with the Junior Chamber of Commerce, Mainline Junior Chamber of Commerce, and we were going through these buildings. And what you can't show on TV is the smell. The smell was unbelievable. I mean, you had 80 people in a room, and no one's taking care of them, and the smell was just incredible. They're not bathed, their bathroom habits were non-existent. It was no one to help them out. And just to see them in that way and just watch them rock and being ignored, and I have to say, it wasn't the attendant's fault. You had 2 attendants for 80 people. I couldn't have done any better, nor anybody I know could have done any better. But this was the condition, and my eyes were just wide open. I was thinking, why doesn't anybody care about this? And that's when I start talking to the attendants, I start talking to some of the administrators, and some of the administrators were elated that I was there, because this is the first time they could get their word out without getting fired.
Baldini's expose was the first that people would see of the inside of Pennhurst during its heyday. The only thing that people had seen were pictures released by Pennhurst itself. These pictures didn't show the gross understaffing, overcrowding, general disrepair, lack of medical supplies, and horrific conditions for the residents. Pennhurst didn't want to show the outside world the truth behind the walls because they feared it might hinder the amount of institutionalized individuals. Pennhurst did not want the public to perceive them as a stereotypical mental asylum. They wanted to be seen as a progressive and contemporary school and state hospital for the mentally challenged. They wanted to avoid the stigma that plagued mental institutes. Instead of having an image as an evil place where cruel things happened, they wanted to cultivate an image of a place where those who don't fit into society can be rehabilitated.
People were shocked when they saw the interviews with Pennhurst staff. Multiple times in Baldini's segments we see interviews with staff members, but only one sticks out as something out of the ordinary. In an interview with a doctor, Baldini inquires about tactics used to discipline the residents of Pennhurst. The doctor admitted to using intravenous tranquilizers to keep difficult residents sedated, and a strange form of isolation therapy on some troublesome residents. This isolation therapy basically consisted of taking residents who were semi-competent and putting them in wards or cottages with residents who could not care for themselves. While this might not sound like a very harsh punishment, it was actually very effective. It is also highly immoral and now is illegal. Putting a resident who was only slightly mentally challenged in with greatly mentally challenged residents was offensive to them. Even though they were challenged, many could easily understand that they didn't belong there. They realized that the people around them had much harsher disabilities and that they did not belong there. It offended them to think that they belonged in a place for the severely challenged. Many mental disabilities rely on habit. Modern forms of therapy center around this, using habits to build a strong, regimented lifestyle. This is vital in creating day-to-day habits and making a mentally handicapped person self-sufficient. However, Baldini discovered that this need for a habit was being exploited as a form of punishment. By changing where a person was living or staying, they could interrupt a habit that had been formed throughout their years of living at Pennhurst. Many people were outraged at the conditions within Pennhurst. Immediately after the expose, people began to call for reform within Pennhurst. The general public viewed the practices within Pennhurst with disgust and general outrage. Baldini's report did a good job showing how bad the conditions were inside of Pennhurst, but it didn't provide anything to compare it to. For many viewers, this was the first time they were seeing the inside of any institute. The practices that were considered awful and disgusting were actually regular practice in the institutes. It was not just specific to Pennhurst. In fact, almost every institute used these practices, or even more barbaric ones. In fact, the practice of lobotomies did not completely cease until the 1970s, a practice that many institutes had used to pacify patients. Pennhurst never performed a single lobotomy on any of its patients throughout its 81-year tenure. In this sense, Pennhurst was actually a progressive institute. All of the practices that the public viewed as horrendous were actually very accepted things within the mental health world at the time.
The public's bad reaction was focused at the wrong thing. Pennhurst was disgusting and overcrowded, but the source of the problem was not Pennhurst itself. The medical practices at Pennhurst were all regular approved techniques. The problem of overcrowding, however, was something that had to be dealt with. Pennhurst was in a very sticky situation, as they were now being perceived as a horrible mental asylum, not the clean, progressive institute that they wanted to be. However, the administrators and workers at Pennhurst, who were under fire, were not actually the ones responsible for the bad conditions.
Pennhurst was not at liberty to turn down residents if they were being committed to the institute by state or county legislature. In this aspect, they were at the mercy of the state. Employees at Pennhurst worked as hard as they could to provide adequate care to the residents, but there were simply not enough of them. As the state committed more and more individuals, they also gave Pennhurst minimal amounts of funding. As seen in Baldini's interview with the superintendent, Pennhurst was in dire need of more funds. They could not physically provide enough care for the amount of residents they had within their walls. This meant that the real cause of this problem was the state government, and by extension, the counties surrounding Pennhurst. Even if Pennhurst couldn't handle the amount of patients, they didn't care. This fact was not brought to attention in Baldini's report, so Pennhurst had to shoulder all the blame.
After Baldini brought Pennhurst to public attention, some improvements were made to the institution. However, it still continued to deteriorate. On May 30, 1974, a lawsuit was filed in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania on behalf of the previous and current residents of Pennhurst against the institution, its superintendents, and the state officials who were in charge of the operation of Pennhurst. The plaintiffs claimed that the institutionalization of their residents was in direct violation of the 1st, 8th, 9th, and 14th Amendments. Additionally, the institutionalization was violating the Pennsylvania Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act of 1966, which states persons who are mentally retarded, senile, alcoholic, or drug dependent shall receive mental health treatment only if they are diagnosed as mentally ill, but these conditions of themselves shall not be deemed to constitute mental illness. These former and current residents appealed for the closing of Pennhurst and the provision of education, training, and care in community settings. After just 32 days, U.S. District Court Judge Raymond J. Broderick came to the conclusion that Pennhurst was grossly overcrowded, understaffed, and lacked the ability to provide rehabilitation for the residents. Additionally, Broderick found various forms of unwarranted restraints. These included seclusion rooms, physical restraints, and psychotropic drugs, which are drugs that affect one's mental state. In his conclusion, Broderick stated that the environment was hazardous to the residents both physically and psychologically, to the point that Pennhurst was not only conducive to learning new skills, but it was also so poor that it contributes to losing skills already learned. Broderick ruled in the plaintiff's favor and found that the current and former residents had 3 sets of constitutional rights violated. First, he ruled that once a resident is admitted to a state institution, they have the constitutional right to be provided with at least the bare minimum of psychiatric rehabilitation. Second, he ruled that the residents of Pennhurst have the constitutional right to be free from physical harm. Finally, he ruled that the residents have the right to non-discriminatory rehabilitation. This was in regards to Pennhurst's immoral treatment of difficult patients, confinement of certain residents when they misbehaved. The court came to the conclusion that each one of these constitutional rights was violated by Pennhurst conditions. Judge Broderick ordered Pennhurst to attain suitable community living arrangements for all of the residents of Pennhurst, together with such community services as are necessary to provide them with minimally adequate habilitation. Additionally, he ordered a special master to oversee the proper placement for each resident and the ultimate closure of Pennhurst. Throughout the next few decades, various aspects of Judge Broderick's decision were appealed. One of Broderick's opinions has a footnote stating, "No one anticipated that this civil action commenced on May 30th, 1974, would be actively litigated for more than 10 years, requiring 2,192 docket entries, about 500 court orders, 28 published opinions, and 3 arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court. The scale of this court case was immense." Judge Broderick's ruling on the constitutional rights of the residents of Pennhurst was never overturned. The two parties negotiated and eventually settled into an agreement that provided living arrangements for the remaining residents of Pennhurst. This settlement was reached almost 12 years after the opening of the court case, and Broderick's original ruling. While Pennhurst would continue to operate through the 12 years that this court case ran, it would close down only 2 years later in 1987.
The two parties involved in the court case came to a settlement in 1985. The largest part of the deal struck between the two parties was that Pennhurst would be shut down, beginning immediately. The courts allowed Pennhurst 3 years to shut down, as such a task is complex and lengthy. All current residents either had to be sent home or relocated to another campus. This procedure would take months for each resident, as many had been institutionalized for all their life, and the family members that had committed them were no longer available. Pennhurst managed to relocate all of their patients in just over 2 years and officially shut down in April of 1987. Once the actual campus was shut down, all that was left to do was transfer all the records and resident histories to the institutions and hospitals that had accepted Pennhurst's residents, and Pennhurst would finally be shut down for good. That procedure lasted another 3 months, and in July of 1987, the last piece of paperwork was filed. After that, Pennhurst was completely and totally shut down. After the institute was shut down, the campus was vacated for good. The newer portions of the campus and the cottages in working condition were renovated and converted into a veterans' home. The farms and fields were sold off to several small businesses and farmers, and the actual main campus was not purchased by anyone. The cost of renovating it or demolishing it to make way for further development was too great, so the main campus stayed untouched until 2010. In 2008, a man named Richard Shahakian purchased the entire main campus from the state at a price of $2 million. He held onto the campus for 2 years without making any changes to it or using it in any way. However, in the summer of 2010, it was announced that the campus, specifically the main administration building and the Mayflower building, would be used as part of a haunted asylum attraction. The attraction was developed in a joint effort between Shahakian and Randy Bates, the owner of the popular haunted attraction, the Bates Motel. Shahakian did face some public backlash in doing this. His advertisements for the haunted house attraction demonstrated that he, or whoever he hired to make them, did not understand the history of Pennhurst at all. The advertisements talked about evil, mad doctors and promised walkthroughs of lobotomy rooms, even though Pennhurst had neither of those things. When people began to point these things out to Shahakian, he said that they had no right to be upset. His defense was that he in no way intended to misinform people about what happened at Pennhurst. He just simply wished to celebrate Halloween. He also said that he anticipated that most of the patrons would be 12 to 20-year-olds with little or no acquaintance with the history of Pennhurst. His argument was turned against him, however, when it was pointed out that if people attending had little to no knowledge of what happened at Pennhurst, and their only exposure came from the haunted asylum attraction, then they might accept the attraction's depiction of Pennhurst as a reality. At the same time that he was turning the main administration building into a haunted house, Shahakian opened the campus up to a number of ghost shows, like Ghost Hunters and Ghost Adventures. These shows only helped to change the image of Pennhurst even more towards an evil asylum. The shows either grossly exaggerated or flat out lied about the events that transpired there, and many people found the way they talked about the people that died there to be disrespectful. They were not malevolent spirits, as Ghost Adventures host Zach Bagans said in his show, but people who were shipped off to an institution by their loved ones and forgotten about. The asylum attraction has been running for 5 years now, and while he still does run it, Shahakian has become less firm on his stance towards the operation of the attraction. He now says that he could not end the asylum attraction even if he wanted to, since he is in contract with Bates and cannot back out of it. The main group opposing the use of the asylum attraction is the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, or PMPA for short. The alliance is made up of past employees and historians who want to preserve the story of Pennhurst. According to their website, Pennhurst was not a place where evil people did evil things. Pennhurst was a place where the mentally retarded were sent by society to be forgotten about. Pennhurst was not evil, it was what society made it. This statement supports the fact that staff members in Pennhurst did all they could. They were just overloaded with work and the sheer number of residents. The goal of the PMPA is to remove the asylum attraction from the campus, and turn at least part of the campus, preferably the iconic administration building, into a museum. A statement from a past employee of Pennhurst found on the PMPA website captures the essence of the PMPA's message as a whole. Pennhurst should not be forgotten about. The records of what happened there should be passed down to the next generations. The campus's current use is a mockery of what happened there. Many of us worked with, cared for, and loved the residents of Pennhurst, and now we are being villainized by an attraction that shows the staff as evil monsters. That is why we need to set the facts straight. Awful things did happen at Pennhurst, and they should be remembered as the way they happened, not as some fake and disgusting gimmick to attract thrill seekers. We had a chance to interview Gregory Perman, the senior vice president for the PMPA. We asked him about his opinions on the current use of the campus.
Evil. I won't say that, usually I won't say anything is evil. The asylum is evil because it's trading on the memories and the histories of people who never did anything wrong, and it's perpetuating falsehoods. You know, we took these people, we sent them somewhere, we dehumanized them, we degraded them, and now, 30 years later, someone is perpetuating that degradation and dehumanization. So.
Yeah, I took a trip to the asylum this October.
I won't hold it against you, but...
Would you... The things that happened there and the things that they showed is, I think, where the general idea that Pennhurst was an evil place actually comes from. Because, like, when you go through the rooms, they have, like, reenactions of lobotomies and stuff like that.
And that never happened.
Yeah, so
well,
do you think that's...
Even if it had happened, it was because
it was the standard medical practice.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you think that's the issue? That's why Pennhurst is thought of in such a way? Is because...
No, I think the asylum... If people know anything at all about Pennhurst, they know the Baldini video and they know the stories. And the stories were there before the asylum opened. The asylum certainly made it worse. I did a panel presentation yesterday to people working in the field. And people asked about why I'm with the group, the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance. We have absolutely nothing to do with the people who own the campus.
Yeah.
They asked us why we haven't stopped the asylum. And one of the people who asked us said, you know, she works with two people who lived at Pennhurst. Here's 30 years after they left. They're living in Philadelphia. They said it upsets them to see this.
During our research, and while we were conducting our interview, it was fairly self-evident that the asylum attraction upsets both past residents and employees alike. The use of Pennhurst as a glorified haunted house with medical undertones is downright disrespectful to the employees who spent their time there caring for their residents and the residents themselves. It seems that what the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance is proposing, to have the campus be renovated and a museum added into the administrative building, is the best choice for Pennhurst's future. It is respectful and commemorates all that happened there. It does not offend any of the workers or residents, and certainly does not create misconceptions like the asylum attraction currently is. The only obstacle standing in the way of the museum is the contract between Bates and Shahakian. When the contract is done, we can only hope that Shahakian will heed the advice of the PMPA and either sell the campus or agree to make changes to his usage of the campus. Only time can tell what the future has in store for Pennhurst.